I have to be honest with you, this isn't some story I cooked up for entertainment. This is a true account of what happened to me in the final months of my career, a sequence of events that proves the old saying that the quietest men often carry the heaviest stones. It all started with the weight of a cheap, gold-plated watch in the palm of my hand. The watch was a parting gift, but I was the only one in that gleaming Chicago ballroom who knew it was actually a countdown timer. As my successor, a man less than half my age, draped his arm over my shoulder with a predator's smile, he whispered in my ear, "The future is here, Arthur. Try not to get lost in the past." That's when I looked down at the inscription on the back of the watch he'd just given me, and the cold, horrifying reality of his betrayal finally clicked into place. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. The party was supposed to be my coronation, a gentle push into the golden sunset of retirement after 40 years of loyal service. 40 years. I had started at Sterling Manufacturing in 1983 as a junior accountant, a skinny kid with a cheap suit and a degree from DePaul University clutched in my sweaty hand. Now, at 65, I was Arthur Finch, the Chief Compliance Officer, the institutional memory, the man they called the Bedrock. My office on the 44th floor of the Aon Center wasn't the biggest, but it had the best view of Millennium Park, a vista I'd earned one meticulously filed report, one late-night audit, one successfully navigated regulatory storm at a time. I had built the company's entire compliance framework from the ground up. I knew where every metaphorical body was buried because I had written the very code of ethics that made burials necessary in the first place. The party, held in the stunning Terzo Piano restaurant at the Art Institute of Chicago, was packed. My wife, Eleanor, was there, looking as beautiful as she did the day I met her. My son, a doctor, and my daughter, a teacher, had flown in. My entire team, men and women I had mentored for decades, stood around me, sharing stories and laughing. It was meant to be the perfect end. The serpent in this corporate Eden was Kean Vance. He'd been appointed CEO 6 months prior, a private equity wunderkind from Silicon Valley brought in to modernize a company he viewed as a dinosaur. Kean was 38, with a smile full of perfectly white teeth and eyes that were as cold and empty as a server farm. He wore $1,000 sneakers with his tailored suits and peppered his speech with meaningless jargon like synergistic disruption and paradigm monetization. From our first meeting, he treated me with a thinly veiled condescension, calling me chief or old-timer but never my actual name. He saw my 4 decades of experience not as an asset, but as a liability, a collection of outdated processes he was eager to sweep away. He made no secret of his disdain for my methodical, paper-trail-heavy approach to compliance. "We're moving to the cloud, Arthur," he'd say, waving a dismissive hand. "We need to be agile, not anchored." I was the anchor. That night, Kean took the stage, a flute of champagne in his hand. He beckoned me to join him, and I did, expecting the usual platitudes. My team applauded warmly. Eleanor beamed. Kean started off well enough, talking about dedication and loyalty. But then, his tone shifted. A subtle, cruel smirk played on his lips. "Arthur here represents a certain era of American business," he began, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "An era of file cabinets. Of triplicate forms. Of waiting for the ink to dry." A few nervous titters went through the younger staff he'd brought in. My team looked uncomfortable. "He's the man who made sure all our T's were crossed and our I's were dotted." So many I's, so many dots. The condescension was thicker now, a palpable thing in the air. But as we pivot towards a more streamlined, data-driven future, we have to admit that some legacy systems are more legacy than system. He then held up a velvet box. "So, as a token of our appreciation for your long tenure, we wanted to give you something." He opened the box and presented me with the watch. It was a gaudy, gold-plated monstrosity from a brand I knew the company gave out for 5-year service anniversaries. It felt like a lead weight in my hand. "A classic timepiece for a classic man," Kean declared, his voice booming. He put his arm around me for the photographers, his grip surprisingly strong. My son stood frozen, his face a mask of thunder. Eleanor's smile had vanished. Kian leaned in close, the smell of expensive cologne and something bitter, like ambition, filling my senses. "The future is here, Arthur. Try not to get lost in the past," he whispered, his breath hot against my ear. A chill, sharp and violent, ran down my spine. It wasn't just a dismissal, it was an erasure. He was mocking my life's work in front of my family and friends, framing my legacy as an obstacle he had heroically overcome. I forced a smile for the cameras, my jaw aching from the effort. After the applause died down and he'd left the stage, I looked at the watch. I was about to put it in my pocket, a worthless token of my own public execution, when my thumb brushed against the back casing. Engraving. I expected my name, the company logo, the dates of my service. My heart pounded in my chest as I tilted it to the light, my aging eyes struggling to focus on the tiny, machine-etched letters. It wasn't my name. It was a quote. Ars longa, vita brevis. Art is long, life is short. It was the motto of Kian's venture capital firm, the one he'd founded before coming to Sterling. It was his brand. His tagline. He hadn't even bothered to get me a generic retirement gift. He had grabbed a piece of his own corporate swag, a cheap bauble meant for some tech bro investor, and handed it to me as the sum total of my 40-year career. It was the ultimate act of contempt. A declaration that I was so insignificant, so utterly worthless in his new vision, that my identity could be casually overwritten with his. In that moment, surrounded by the murmur of the crowd, the clinking of glasses, and the ghost of my own career, I felt a profound and terrifying stillness descend upon me. It was the kind of quiet that comes not before a storm, but from the absolute center of it. He thought he was closing a book, but he had just given me the very first sentence of a brand new, and far darker, chapter. The first few weeks of retirement were a disorienting blur of quiet mornings and aimless afternoons. The relentless rhythm that had governed my life for 4 decades, the 6 a.m. alarm, the 7:15 train from Oak Park, the familiar weight of my briefcase, was gone. In its place was a vast, echoing emptiness. Eleanor tried her best, suggesting hobbies, planning trips, coaxing me into the garden. But I felt like a ghost haunting my own home, a man disconnected from his purpose. My identity had been so completely interwoven with Sterling Manufacturing that without it, I felt transparent. The humiliation of that night played on a loop in my mind. Kian's smug face, the nervous laughter, the weight of that insulting watch, which now sat in a drawer in my desk, a cold, metallic reminder of my own obsolescence. I stopped answering calls from former colleagues. I couldn't bear their pity. I was Arthur Finch, the man who had been publicly discarded. One drizzly Tuesday afternoon, about a month after the party, I was paying bills online when a news alert popped up in my feed. Sterling Manufacturing shatters profit expectations under new CEO Kian Vance. I clicked on it, my stomach tightening. The article was a glowing puff piece, filled with quotes from a triumphant Kian. He spoke of aggressive streamlining and unlocking hidden value. The company's stock had surged nearly 30%. The financial analysts were hailing him as a miracle worker. I read the numbers, and a small, dissonant chord struck in my brain. The profit margins he was claiming, they were astronomical. Impossible, even. Sterling was a solid, reliable company, a maker of high-grade industrial components. We built things to last. Our margins were respectable but predictable. We weren't a software company that could scale revenue overnight. To achieve the kind of growth Kian was reporting would require either a revolutionary new product, which I knew we didn't have, or a fundamental, and likely dangerous, change to the cost structure. Curiosity, the old professional instinct I thought had been extinguished, began to stir. It was a faint flicker in the darkness, but it was there. I spent the rest of the day digging into their publicly available quarterly reports, my old reading glasses perched on my nose. The numbers were beautifully presented, packaged in sleek, minimalist graphics that were Kian's signature. But the substance was wrong. Raw material costs were listed as being significantly lower than market rates, while shipping and logistics expenses had somehow been slashed by half. I had personally negotiated some of Sterling's long-term materials contracts. I knew what we paid for high-tensile steel and specialized polymers. There was no way to get those costs that low without sacrificing quality to a degree that would be suicidal for our reputation. I called up Frank, my former number 2, a man I'd hired 30 years ago. He was a good man, but a nervous one, always worried about rocking the boat. "Frank, it's Arthur. How are you?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Arthur. Good to hear from you," he said, his voice strained. "We miss you around here." "I'm sure," I said dryly. "Listen, Frank, I was just looking at the Q2 numbers. They're incredible. How did Kian manage to cut the materials budget so drastically?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear him breathing, the faint sound of a keyboard clicking. "Look, Arthur, things are different now," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "It's all about agile sourcing. We have a new procurement partner. A consulting group Kian brought in. They handle all the logistics now." A procurement partner? That was new. Sterling had always handled its own sourcing. It was central to our quality control. "What's their name?" I asked. "Apex Logistics," he mumbled. "Never heard of them." "They're very efficient," Frank said, the word sounding hollow. "Listen, Arthur, I've got to run into a meeting. It was great to talk to you." He hung up before I could ask another question. The abruptness of the call, the fear in his voice, was a blaring red flag. Frank was terrified. Apex Logistics. The name sounded generic, forgettable. Deliberately so. I spent the next hour searching for them online. The company had a bare-bones website, full of stock photos and corporate platitudes. It listed a corporate address in Wilmington, Delaware, a notorious haven for anonymous shell corporations. The company had been incorporated just 4 months ago, 2 months after Kian took over as CEO. The gears in my head, rusty from disuse, began to slowly, deliberately turn. This wasn't just aggressive management. This was something else. Something rotten. That night, I couldn't sleep. I went down to my study, the faint glow of the Chicago skyline visible through the window. I opened my desk drawer and took out the watch. Ars longa, vita brevis. His motto. His brand. Stamped onto my legacy. A surge of cold anger washed over me, clearer and more potent than the fog of depression I'd been living in. He hadn't just humiliated me. He was destroying the company I had spent my life protecting. He was using it as his personal piggy bank, and the impossible numbers were his way of bragging. He thought the old man was gone, put out to pasture, lost in the past. He thought no one was watching. I booted up my old personal laptop. Before I left Sterling, I had created a secure, encrypted tunnel into the company's servers for emergency remote access during my compliance audits. It was a backdoor that only I knew about, a relic of an older, less cloud-based system. I had never told Kian or his new tech team about it. It was, in his parlance, a legacy system. I typed in the credentials, my fingers moving with an old, familiar certainty. A string of code scrolled across the screen. My heart hammered against my ribs. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, a single word appeared, access_granted. I was in. And for the first time in a month, I felt my purpose return, not as the protector of a company, but as the architect of one man's ruin. The server was a digital ghost town of my own making. Decades of my work were archived here, a labyrinth of folders, subfolders, and encrypted audit logs. Kian's new team had migrated most of the active operations to their sleek cloud platform, leaving the old server as a neglected attic, full of relics they considered irrelevant. They didn't know that the relics held the truth. My first stop was the procurement directory. I found the new contracts with Apex Logistics. As I suspected, they were a hollow shell. The paperwork was pristine, drafted by a high-priced law firm, but it was designed to obscure, not clarify. Apex was now the sole supplier for our most critical raw materials. They were charging sterling a price that was, inexplicably, 15% above the established market rate. And yet, Kian was reporting record low material costs on the public financials. It made no sense. How could you pay more but report spending less? It was a paradox, a magic trick. And like all magic tricks, it relied on misdirection. My hands trembled slightly as I navigated deeper, using old administrative protocols to unearth the archived payment authorizations. I was looking for the bank routing numbers, the digital breadcrumbs that always lead you home. The payments to Apex were being routed through their registered bank in Delaware, but I found something else, something Kian's team had missed. In the metadata of the transaction logs, buried under layers of routine system notations, were the IP addresses of the terminals that had authorized the final wire transfers. Most were from Sterling's headquarters in Chicago. But 3 of them, all for the largest payments, originated from a different IP address. A private one. A simple reverse IP lookup took less than 10 seconds. The address was registered to a luxury residential high-rise in the Cayman Islands. A place notorious for being a financial graveyard where money went to die, far from the prying eyes of regulators. This was the first part of the trick: overpay a shell company, which then kicks back the excess funds to an offshore account. It was a classic embezzlement scheme, but it still didn't explain the phenomenal profits Kian was reporting. Embezzlement creates a loss, a hole in the books. Kian had created a geyser of cash. The answer had to be on the other side of the equation, the actual, physical materials. Frank had mentioned strange shipping manifests. I dug into the logistics server, a part of the system so archaic and clunky that Kian's tech bros had likely never even looked at it. I pulled up the bill of lading for the last 6 months. What I found made the blood drain from my face. Sterling Manufacturing produced, among other things, a proprietary alloy, we called it S27, renowned for its incredible tensile strength and resistance to corrosion. It was the gold standard in the aerospace and medical device industries. It was also incredibly expensive to produce. According to the manifests, our primary S27 production facility in Gary, Indiana, was shipping nearly 40% of its output not to our customers, but to a warehouse in Wisconsin. A warehouse owned and operated by Apex Logistics. The full picture began to crystallize in my mind, elegant in its sheer, sociopathic audacity. Step 1. Kian, through his anonymous shell company Apex, buys Sterling's own premier alloy at a massively discounted, internal transfer price. Step 2. Apex then sells that same alloy back to Sterling at an inflated price, creating a fraudulent paper trail that makes it look like a legitimate, albeit expensive, materials purchase. Step 3. Kian pockets the difference in an offshore account. But the genius of the scheme, the part that created the fake profits, was that the material never actually left the Sterling supply chain. It was a closed loop of fraud. He was selling our own product back to us and booking the transaction as new revenue. He wasn't just stealing from the company, he was using the company's own assets to create a phantom economy, a hall of mirrors designed to deceive shareholders and inflate the stock price until he could trigger a massive bonus payout or sell the hollowed-out husk for a fortune. He was a parasite, fattening himself on the host's blood while convincing the world he was the source of its vitality. For 2 weeks, I lived a double life. By day, I was Arthur Finch, the retiree, puttering in the garden and going for long walks with Eleanor. By night, I was a digital wraith, silently moving through the abandoned corridors of Sterling's old network. I downloaded everything: contracts, manifests, transaction logs, internal emails. I created a multi-layered encrypted file, a digital bomb of evidence. I discovered the identity of the registered agent for Apex Logistics in the Caymans, a man named Julian Croft. A quick search revealed Croft had been a partner at Kian's old venture capital firm, a man who had left in disgrace after a previous fund collapsed under whispers of financial misconduct. Kian hadn't just hired a contractor, he had enlisted his old partner in crime. The arrogance of it was breathtaking. He believed he was completely untouchable. He believed the old world, my world, was too slow, too stupid, too analog to ever catch him. He saw me as a relic of the past, but the past has a long memory. The weight of what I had uncovered was immense. This wasn't just about my humiliation anymore. This was a crime that threatened the pensions of the thousands of employees who had dedicated their lives to Sterling. Frank, my nervous friend, and all the others. Kian was gambling with their futures, all for his own enrichment. I had the evidence, a mountain of it. But I knew that simply handing it over to the authorities would be a mistake. Kian was a master of plausible deniability. He would mire the investigation and litigation for years. His expensive lawyers would paint me as a disgruntled, senile old man seeking revenge. He would sacrifice Julian Croft, claim he was a rogue contractor, and walk away with a slap on the wrist while the company crumbled. No. That wasn't justice. Justice, I decided, had to be as personal and as public as the humiliation he had inflicted upon me. I didn't just want to expose him. I wanted to dismantle him. I wanted to stand in the wreckage of his life and watch him realize that the old man he discarded was the one who'd lit the fuse. My 40 years of meticulous, patient, by-the-book work had prepared me for this. I would not be the bedrock he built his fraudulent empire upon. I would be the geological fault line that ripped it all apart. Kian Vance was more than a CEO, he was a brand. A carefully constructed myth of the boy genius, the visionary disruptor. His face was on the cover of Chicago Business Monthly under the headline The Sterling Touch, How One Man Reinvented American Industry. He gave TEDx talks in Chicago, pacing the stage in that uniform of his, the sharp suit and gleaming white sneakers, talking about a future I knew was built on a foundation of lies. He spoke of stakeholder value while looting the company pension fund. He praised transparency while operating a criminal enterprise through offshore shell corporations. He was the toast of the city's financial elite, a golden boy whose every pronouncement was treated as gospel. His power wasn't just in his position, it was in his narrative. He had convinced everyone that he was the future, and anyone who questioned him was, by definition, the past. He was insulated by layers of wealth, influence, and public adoration. He lived in a stunning duplex penthouse at the top of the St. Regis, with panoramic views of Lake Michigan and a social life that put him at every important charity gala and political fundraiser in the city. He was dating a local news anchor, and their carefully curated romance was chronicled in the society pages. To the world, Kian Vance was invincible. And this, I knew, was his greatest vulnerability. Men who believe they are gods never bother to check for cracks in their temple. My first attempt to find an ally was a sobering lesson in the reality of power. Armed with a portion of my anonymized evidence, I sought a consultation with a top financial fraud lawyer in the loop, a man with a reputation for taking on corporate giants. I sat in his plush office, surrounded by leather-bound books and framed legal victories, and laid out the basic framework of Kian's scheme. The lawyer, a man named Peterson, listened patiently, steepling his fingers. He looked at the documents, his expression unreadable. When I was finished, he leaned back in his chair and gave me a tired smile. "Mr. Finch," he began, his voice smooth and condescending, "this is a compelling theory. It truly is. But what you have here is a collection of circumstantial data. You're alleging a sophisticated conspiracy against a man who is, for all intents and purposes, the darling of the Chicago business community." He explained the legal hurdles. The evidence, obtained through my unauthorized access, would be deemed inadmissible, fruit of the poisonous tree. It would be my word against Kian's. My reputation as a disgruntled former employee against his as a celebrated visionary. Kian Vance can afford to keep this tied up in court until your great-grandchildren are in college, Peterson concluded, sliding my folder back across the polished mahogany desk. He will bury you in legal fees and destroy what's left of your reputation. My advice? Enjoy your retirement. Let this go. I walked out of that office on LaSalle Street and into the cold autumn air, the city's skyscrapers looming over me like stone-faced judges. Peterson was right. The formal, legal route was a fortress designed to protect men like Kian. To attack him there would be suicide. I felt a familiar wave of despair wash over me. For a moment, his power seemed absolute, his position unassailable. I went home, defeated. Eleanor found me in my study late that night, staring at the screen of my computer, the intricate web of Kian's fraud displayed before me. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. He had thought of everything. He had created a perfect crime. "What is it, Arthur?" she asked softly, placing a hand on my shoulder. "What has been consuming you?" I hesitated, then I told her. Everything. The party, the watch, the late-night sessions on the server, the impossible numbers, Apex Logistics, the Cayman Islands, the lawyer's dismissal. I laid it all bare. I expected her to be frightened, to tell me to listen to the lawyer, to let it go for my own safety. But she didn't. She listened in silence, her expression hardening with each detail. When I was finished, she walked over to my desk and picked up the cheap, gold-plated watch. She held it in her palm, her gaze distant. "When your father was forced into early retirement from the steel mill," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "he didn't say a word. He just faded. He let them take his dignity because he thought he had no other choice. He spent the last 10 years of his life feeling like a ghost." She looked at me, her eyes boring into mine. "You are not your father, Arthur. You are the man who taught our children that the hardest right is always better than the easiest wrong. You built that company's conscience. Are you really going to let a charlatan like that tear it down and erase you in the process?" She placed the watch firmly in my hand. Its metal was cold against my skin. "He thinks you're irrelevant," she said. "He thinks you're powerless. That's your weapon. Use it." Her words were like a pail of cold water to the face, shocking me out of my despair. She was right. The lawyer was thinking about a battle. I needed to be thinking about a war. A war fought on a different battlefield. Kian's power wasn't just financial, it was perceptual. He controlled the narrative. So, I would have to become a better storyteller. I would not attack his fortress head-on. I would become like water, seeping into the cracks he didn't even know existed. I would use his own arrogance, his own hunger for public acclaim, his own carefully constructed image, as the very weapons of his destruction. My resolve, which had wavered, now solidified into something cold and unbreakable. I wasn't going to seek justice through the system was rigged. I was going to create a new system, a new set of rules. I looked at the complex diagram of his fraud on my screen, no longer with despair, but with the focused intensity of a watchmaker. It was an intricate machine, yes, but every machine has a critical gear. Every machine can be broken. My objective was no longer just to expose a crime. It was to orchestrate a complete and undeniable collapse. I would not be the ghost of Sterling Manufacturing's past. I would be the architect of Kian Vance's future, and it would be a future of absolute ruin. The war began not with a cannon blast, but with a whisper. My first move was to create a new identity. I became Cassandra, an anonymous blogger on a niche financial whistleblowing forum. The name was deliberate, the prophetess who was cursed to tell the truth but never be believed. It was the perfect cover. I wrote in a style completely different from my own, sharp, cynical, full of the kind of insider jargon that the financial media loves. I never mentioned Sterling Manufacturing directly. Instead, I started writing posts about theoretical vulnerabilities in industrial supply chains. I wrote about the dangers of agile sourcing, the rise of anonymous logistics partners, and how a sufficiently clever CEO could, in theory, create a closed-loop system to generate phantom revenue. I was describing Kian's exact scheme, but framing it as a hypothetical case study. It was a lure. I was seeding the water, waiting for the right shark to catch the scent of blood. The shark I had in mind was a woman named Maya Singh. She was a tenacious, independent financial journalist who ran a subscription-based blog called The Ledger. She had a reputation for breaking stories the mainstream press was too timid to touch. She was a bloodhound who delighted in taking down corporate titans. After 2 weeks of posting my theoretical articles, I sent an anonymous, encrypted email to her public tip line. The subject line was, Hypothetical Case Study, The Sterling Loophole. In the body, I simply wrote, my theories aren't so theoretical. Start with a company that makes high-grade industrial components. Look for a new CEO from the tech world. Look for a new, mysterious logistics partner registered in Delaware. Look at their quarterly reports. The numbers don't lie, but they can be made to tell lies. Cassandra. I attached a single, heavily redacted document, a shipping manifest showing a transfer of S27 alloy from Sterling's Indiana plant to the Apex warehouse in Wisconsin. It was just one piece of the puzzle, not enough to prove anything, but enough to light a fire under a journalist like her. While Maya began to dig, I started on my second front, the human element. Kian's arrogance made him sloppy with people. He treated his underlings as disposable tools, and I knew that resentment was a powerful, combustible fuel. I started with Frank, my old number 2. I met him for a beer at a quiet, old man bar in the West Loop, far from the trendy spots Kian and his cronies frequented. Frank looked terrible. He'd lost weight, and his eyes were dark with anxiety. "Arthur, I can't talk about work," he said immediately, nervously looking around. "I signed a new NDA. It's ironclad." "I'm not asking you to, Frank," I said calmly. "I'm retired, remember? I just want to talk about pensions." I slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a printout of the Sterling Employee Pension Fund's recent investment portfolio activity. It was public information, but you had to know where to look. "See this?" I pointed to a massive, recent investment in a high-risk, unrated bond fund based in the Caribbean. Over 20% of the entire fund moved last month. On whose authority? Frank stared at the paper, his face turning pale. The pension committee, which I had once chaired, was supposed to approve any changes to the investment strategy. The rules were strict, designed to protect the employees' futures with low-risk, stable investments. Kian disbanded the old committee, Frank whispered, his voice cracking. He said it was inefficient. He and the new CFO have total discretion now. "He's gambling with your retirement, Frank," I said, my voice low and steady. "He's using your money, my money, as his personal slush fund to cover the margins on his dirty deals. When this all collapses, the stock will be worthless, the company will be bankrupt, and the pension fund will be an empty shell. He'll walk away with his offshore millions. What will you have?" I didn't need to ask for his help. I had planted a seed of righteous fear. Frank was a company man, but he was also a family man. Kian had threatened the one thing he couldn't afford to lose. I left him sitting there, staring at the piece of paper, the gears of loyalty and self-preservation grinding in his mind. My final target was the most delicate, the board of directors. They were, for the most part, old-guard industrialists who had been charmed by Kian's talk of modernization and soaring stock prices. They were captivated by his narrative. To shatter it, I couldn't use data or manifests. I had to use emotion. I had to attack Kian's character. I knew from my time at the company that the chairman of the board, a formidable old patriarch named Marcus Thorne, had one great passion outside of business, collecting rare, first-edition books. His most prized possession was a signed copy of Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises. I also knew, from a stray comment Kian had made at a holiday party, that Kian had once dismissed classic literature as a waste of bandwidth. Using a burner phone and a voice modulator, I called Marcus Thorne's office, claiming to be a rare book dealer. I told his assistant I had come into possession of a unique piece of correspondence, a letter written by Hemingway, and I believed Mr. Thorne would be the only person in the country who could appreciate its value. Intrigued, he agreed to a meeting. We met at a private club, the kind with dark wood and the smell of old leather. I presented myself as a humble estate appraiser. And I gave him the letter. It was, of course, a forgery. A brilliant one, created by a specialist I'd found online. But the content of the letter was the real weapon. In it, the fake Hemingway wrote to his editor about a young, ambitious social climber he'd met in Paris, a man who was brilliant and charming on the surface, but utterly hollow inside, a man who saw people only as rungs on a ladder and who built his success on the stolen ideas and hard work of others. The description was a thinly veiled, perfect portrait of Kian Vance. I had even woven in specific phrases Kian had used in board meetings, phrases I knew he had stolen from articles and books without attribution. As Marcus Thorne read the letter, his expression shifted from scholarly interest to a slow, dawning recognition. He looked up at me, his eyes narrowed. "This is uncanny," he murmured. I simply nodded. History, Mr. Thorne, has a way of repeating its archetypes. I didn't need to say another word. I had bypassed his logical brain and planted a seed of doubt directly into his intuition. I had used his own passion, his own worldview, to paint Kian not as a visionary, but as a cheap, timeless villain. The foundation of the temple was beginning to crack. Maya was digging, Frank was panicking, and the chairman was thinking. The pieces were moving into place, all in silence, all in the shadows cast by Kian's own blinding spotlight. The first tremor hit on a Monday morning. Maya Singh published her article. It was a masterpiece of journalistic aggression, headlined, "The Apex Predator, Is Sterling Manufacturing's Miracle Growth a High-Tech Mirage?" She didn't have the full story yet, but she had enough to ask the right questions. She laid out the mysterious appearance of Apex Logistics, its opaque corporate structure in Delaware, and the statistically improbable surge in Sterling's profit margins. She quoted anonymous sources from within the shipping industry who questioned the legitimacy of Sterling's logistics costs. She stopped short of making a direct accusation of fraud, but the implication was a thunderclap in the silent, respectable world of corporate finance. The article was a bomb. Sterling stock, which had been on a meteoric rise, wobbled, dropping 8% by midday. Kian's response was swift and furious. He issued a press release decrying the article as a baseless attack by a short-sighted blogger engaging in yellow journalism. He called it a smear campaign orchestrated by competitors. In a televised interview on a financial network, he was the picture of calm, righteous indignation. "We are innovators," he said, looking directly into the camera, his handsome face a mask of sincerity. "And when you disrupt the status quo, the old guard will always try to tear you down. This is the price of progress." He was good. I had to admit it. He was spinning the narrative masterfully, positioning himself as the victim, the brave visionary under siege. His performance calmed the market, and by the end of the week, the stock had recovered most of its losses. To the outside world, it looked like Kian had weathered the storm. But I knew better. I had seen the list of IP addresses that had accessed the article on Maya's site within the first hour of its publication. Dozens of them were from within Sterling's own network. But more importantly, 3 were from the private network of the law firm representing Sterling's board of directors, and 1 was from the personal home network of Marcus Thorne, the chairman. The whisper had been heard. Inside the temple, the priests were growing nervous. My next move had to be more direct. Frank, consumed by my warning about the pension fund, had become my reluctant inside source. He was a nervous wreck, communicating with me only through encrypted messaging apps on a burner phone I'd given him. He confirmed my worst fears. Kian and his CFO were using the pension fund as collateral for a series of high-risk derivatives trades, trying to generate enough cash to cover the holes their scheme was creating. They were robbing the employees to pay for the fraud that was destroying the company. It was a death spiral. I now had a moral imperative that went beyond my own revenge. I had to save the futures of the men and women I had worked with for decades. The annual shareholder meeting was in 3 weeks. It was Kian's chosen stage, the place where he would announce a major corporate acquisition, a final, grand illusion to cement his legacy and trigger a colossal bonus payout before he sold off the company. The meeting was my deadline. That would be the day the temple would fall. I packaged my evidence into 2 separate, meticulously organized digital files. The first file was for the SEC. It was the cold, hard data, the transaction logs, the offshore account details, the shipping manifests, the pension fund transfers. It was a complete, undeniable roadmap of the crime, supported by a 20-page narrative I wrote explaining every step. I set it up on a server with a dead man's switch. If I didn't input a code every 12 hours, the entire package would be automatically sent to the lead enforcement agent at the SEC's Chicago office. It was my insurance policy. The second file was different. It was more personal. More cruel. It was from Marcus Thorne and the board. It contained a curated selection of the financial evidence, but it also included things designed to inflict maximum psychological damage on Kian. I had discovered, through my digging, that Kian's entire persona was a lie. His innovative corporate strategies were plagiarized almost word for word from the master's thesis of a former girlfriend he'd cheated on. I had found the thesis. I had also found emails between Kian and Julian Croft, his partner in crime, where they openly mocked the Sterling board members, calling them dinosaurs and glorified paperweights. The most damning was a recording. Frank, in a moment of panic and bravery, had managed to secretly record a meeting where Kian bragged about how he was playing the board like a fiddle and how the old man Arthur Finch had been too senile to see any of it coming. 2 days before the shareholder meeting, I executed the final phase of the plan. I sent the second file, the one with the insults, the plagiarism, and the recording, to Marcus Thorne's personal, encrypted email address. The sender was, once again, anonymous. The subject line was simple: the price of progress. I didn't include any demands or instructions. I simply gave him the information. I knew a man like Thorne, a proud patriarch of the old guard, would not tolerate being played for a fool. The personal insults would wound his pride in a way that spreadsheets and transaction logs never could. It was no longer an abstract financial problem, it was a direct assault on his intelligence and his authority. I had given him the evidence not just of a crime against the company, but of a profound and personal betrayal. The choice was now his: protect the charlatan who was mocking him behind his back, or reassert his power and burn the whole thing to the ground. I was betting on the pride of a dinosaur. I checked my dead man switch, reset the 12-hour timer, and waited. The silence was deafening. The war was over. All that was left was the final, public execution. The shareholder meeting was held in the grand ballroom of the Four Seasons Hotel Chicago. The room was a sea of dark suits and nervous energy, the air thick with the smell of money and expensive coffee. I was there, sitting in the back, an anonymous face in the crowd. I owned exactly 100 shares of Sterling stock, a relic from an old executive compensation plan, which gave me the right to be in this room. To anyone who noticed me, I was just another elderly shareholder, a harmless old man checking on his modest investment. Kian took the stage to thunderous applause. He was in his element, radiating charisma and unshakable confidence. His smile was dazzling, his movements fluid. He looked like a king addressing his court. He launched into his presentation, the fraudulent numbers flashing up on the giant screens behind him: record profits, unprecedented growth, boundless future. He was a maestro conducting a symphony of lies, and the audience was captivated. I watched Marcus Thorne and the other board members sitting in the front row. Their faces were grim, their bodies rigid. They were not applauding. Thorne sat like a statue, his eyes fixed on Kian, his expression a mask of cold fury. Kian, blinded by the stage lights and his own ego, didn't seem to notice. He was building to his grand finale, the announcement of the acquisition of a smaller, innovative tech firm. This merger, he declared, his voice ringing with triumph, will position Sterling Manufacturing not just as a leader in American industry, but as a dominant force in the global technology landscape for the next century. The room buzzed with excitement. This was the news the market had been waiting for. As he paused for effect, basking in the glow of his own perceived brilliance, Marcus Thorne stood up. A hush fell over the ballroom. The chairman of the board never interrupted the CEO's keynote. Thorne walked calmly to a microphone set up for the Q&A session. He didn't wait his turn. He just stood there, a figure of immense, unyielding gravity. Kian looked momentarily confused, his perfect smile faltering. "Marcus," he said, forcing a chuckle, a little eager for the Q&A, "are we?" "I'm not quite finished." "Oh, I think you are, Kian," Thorne said, his voice quiet but carrying the cold authority of a death sentence. It echoed through the silent room. "I have just one question for you. It's about a particular line item in the pension fund's investment portfolio. A Caribbean bond fund called the Triton Diversified Growth Fund. Can you please explain to the shareholders what, exactly, that fund invests in, And why you and the CFO personally authorized the transfer of $200 million of our employees' retirement money into it 2 months ago, without board approval? The color drained from Kian's face. It happened so fast, it was like watching a light bulb burn out. The name of the fund was a detail so deep in the weeds he would have never expected anyone, least of all the chairman, to know it. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was completely, utterly blindsided. He looked out at the sea of faces, his eyes wide with panic, searching for an escape that wasn't there. At that exact moment, as if on cue, a wave of digital noise filled the room. The low hum of 100 phones vibrating at once. On the screen of my own burner phone, I saw the notification. Maya Singh's new article had just gone live. The headline was devastating, exclusive, Sterling CEO Kian Vance implicated in massive fraud, pension fund looting. Leaked recording and SEC probe pending. She had it all. Someone on the board, likely Thorne himself, had leaked her the entire package. They had decided to control the demolition. As Kian stood frozen on the stage, the doors at the back of the ballroom opened. 2 men and a woman in dark, conservative suits walked in. They moved with a quiet, unmistakable purpose. SEC enforcement. They walked down the center aisle, their footsteps the only sound in the cavernous, silent room. They didn't hurry. They didn't need to. Kian watched them approach, his body trembling, the charismatic visionary replaced by a terrified, cornered animal. They walked right up to the stage. One of the agents looked up at him and said something I couldn't hear, but the meaning was clear. The king had been deposed. His reign was over. His meticulously constructed world, his brand, his future, it had all been shattered in the space of 90 seconds by a single, perfectly timed question and a ghost he never saw coming. I stood up and walked out before they escorted him off the stage. My work was done. In the weeks that followed, the collapse of Kian Vance was total and absolute. The media, which had built him into a god, took a gleeful, almost sadistic pleasure in tearing him down. Every detail of his fraud was laid bare. His plagiarism, his offshore accounts, his affair with the news anchor, it all came out. He was a pariah, a late-night punchline, a cautionary tale. Sterling Manufacturing filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, but under the guidance of a court-appointed trustee and the old board, a restructuring plan was put in place. The pension fund was salvaged, thanks to the SEC freezing Kian's assets before he could move them. The employees I had worried about would be protected. Frank called me once, his voice full of a relief so profound it was almost painful to hear. "You saved us, Arthur," he said. "You saved us all." I told him I had simply done my job. Kian Vance was indicted on multiple federal counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and embezzlement. He faced decades in prison. His partner, Julian Croft, turned state's evidence against him in exchange for a lighter sentence. The invincible golden boy was left with nothing but a team of overworked public defenders. His temple had not just cracked, it had been leveled, and its foundations plowed with salt. I followed the news from the quiet of my study in Oak Park. I felt no elation, no thrill of victory. My revenge had not been a hot-blooded, passionate act. It had been cold, meticulous, and methodical. It was the work of a compliance officer. I had simply found a catastrophic error in the system and corrected it. One evening, Eleanor came into the study and found me sitting in the dark, the faint city lights twinkling in the distance. She didn't turn on the lamp. She just stood beside my chair, her hand resting on my shoulder. We stayed like that for a long time, in a comfortable, shared silence. My life was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the echoing emptiness of obsolescence, it was the peaceful stillness of a purpose fulfilled. I had been cast aside, dismissed as a relic from a bygone era, a man lost in the past. But it was my knowledge of the past, of the old servers, of the foundational rules of ethical finance, of the timeless patterns of human greed and hubris, that had allowed me to reclaim the future, not just for myself, but for the hundreds of people Kian had been so willing to sacrifice. I opened my desk drawer and took out the cheap, gold-plated watch. I won the crown, and the second hand began to tick, a steady, rhythmic beat in the silent room. Kian had meant it as an insult, a symbol of my irrelevance, a marker of my time being over. But he had been wrong. He gave me a watch to mark the end of my time, but I used it to count down the seconds to the end of his. The end.